Greetings, everybody. Greetings. Welcome to this amazing NASBE Project Grad Attendance Works joint webinar that we're hosting today. We're going to give it a minute before we get started. Hopefully you're in the right place. If you're looking at the slide, chronic absence data review and strategies for student re-engagement. No, I am not Santa Claus, but I play him on your screen today because my theme for today is NASBE Wonderland, a beautiful sight. We're happy tonight, walking in the NASBE Wonderland. So I hope everybody's in the Christmas spirit, and greetings to all of you. I hope you are as excited as I am for this amazing encounter, because you really have two rock stars of the education, policy, and practice community to share their insights on this amazing, incredibly important topic, right? Because if you think about it, and we all know this intuitively, but it eludes us sometimes about just how logical it really is that, you can't learn if you're not there, right? You can't experience what schools and the educational experience is there to provide you if you're not present. And so this issue of chronic absenteeism, and I tip my hat to Hedy and her organization for really championing the cause of getting people to understand the data, understand the issues, pay attention to this issue, and really, drill into it because it's really that important. And then Bob and his team are doing amazing things because, again, if you're about helping students, reach the finish line from a K-12 perspective and be ready, chronic absence sits at, attendance sits at the hub of that. And so it's hugely important to making sure that our students are geared up for success. As was stated, I'm Paulo DeMaria. I'm the president and CEO of the National Association of State Boards of Education. It's delightful to have all of you here joining us today on this Tuesday afternoon. I'm going to start by just giving you a few logistical issues. Keep your devices quiet. This webinar is being recorded. We will make that recording available when it's developed, and then we'll make sure we send it out if you registered and provided us with your email address. We've also enabled closed captioning if that's an accessibility functionality that you prefer using. Please use, you'll notice at the top of your screen or the bottom of your screen, the Q&A function. That's where we'd like you to submit your questions. Please do that at any time during the webinar. Because we will we will interject as appropriate to make sure that we are asking the questions that are on your minds. For those of you who submitted questions in advance, thank you for that, and we will be using those to drive the discussion portion of the webinar once we get through the presentation. Also, look to the chat box. You'll see resources being deposited there. And other things that you can find useful that will amplify what's happening here in the webinar itself. I also want to make reference to the fact that for those of you who are State Board of Education members, in other words, NASBE's core constituency, this is one of our webinars and then some, where the and then some is you all get to split off into your own little area of Zoom, and we'll have a more intimate conversation with Hedy and Bob about this issue, and other areas of expertise that they bring to the table. And that will happen at 3:15, and I'll give you more specific instructions about how exactly to do that. But we're excited. We've done this before. It really works out well because we can have this large community engaging around the issue, and then we can have a more intimate conversation among state board members and some of the unique intersections with the work of state boards and these ideas. Renee, take me to the next slide. Oh, and for those of you who just want to better understand what we do at NASBE, one of our the things that we're most proud of is our flagship publication, the State Education Standard. And the most recent issue was called Engaging All Students. And it's really focused on this notion that when students are engaged, again, it's kind of a simple idea. When students are engaged, the learning experience is going to be that much more robust and more impactful for them. And Hedy and Bob both contributed to this publication. They also were contributors to our annual conference. Hedy had a wonderful session. I was just telling her how much I enjoyed the ideas about it. She'll talk a little bit about what she did at the end of her presentation. Bob was also there, and talking about the things that the Grad Partnership is working on, and and how do you actually be deliberate and systematic about helping every student reach the success that we want them to achieve as they transition from high school into whatever comes next. If you have not read Engaging All Students, the NASBE issue of the State Education Standard, you can find that on our website at nasbe.org, and I would commend it to you because we had 7 or 8 wonderful authors writing great content. Go ahead, Renee. I don't have to introduce these 2 individuals. I'll let them introduce themselves a little bit because they're really well known. And these are beautiful pictures of them because they have great smiles and they've got great attitude and they're very passionate about the work they do. And that to me is the sort of the trifecta of what makes for wonderful people who work in the education policy and practice space. Hedy is the founder and the executive director of Attendance Works, which I love these organizations that have this laser-like focus on a key issue that they know can make a difference. And that's what Attendance Works is all about. And Bob is at Johns Hopkins doing great work as a member of the faculty there, but also in charge of the Grad Partnership, which again is really focused on how do we deliberately approach this issue of helping make sure every student is successful. And so I think that's the last of my slides, right? So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Hedy, I think, to put her slides up and just sit back, take notes, enjoy the brilliance of these 2 amazing individuals, but also pay heed to the things that they say. Because the other thing I found is that they put things in ways that are easily both understandable and digestible and also actionable. And I think that's really, at the end of the day, what we really want to ask ourselves during this process is, what can I do to make a difference in this space? Hedy, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here, Paolo, and to be joining with Matt, NASBE, and everyone on this call. I'm going to just dive straight into starting off our presentation of this review of chronic absence data, which has been our pleasure at Attendance Works to partner with Johns Hopkins University, everyone graduates a center, particularly Bob and Von Burns, to be able to do this analysis. But just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I'm going to do some basics. So we are talking about the issue of chronic absence, which is broadly referred to as missing so much school for any reason, excused, unexcused, or suspensions, that you have missed so much opportunities in in the classroom, as Paolo talked about, that you're academically at risk. And we've been coining for the last 10 years, getting people to think about it as missing 10% or more of school for any reason. And the reason it's a 10%, it is part of that early warning systems that Bob talks a lot about, but then you notice the kid missing 2 days in the first month, 4 days in the second month, 6 days in the third month. So you're not waiting till the kid's already missed 18 days before you take action. That is really different from truancy. And average daily attendance, truancy being unexcused absences, average daily attendance being how many kids typically show up each day. And this really matters because we know with data that chronic absence starting as early as pre-K and first is an indicator that kids are less likely to read on grade level by the end of 3rd grade, more likely to have achievement, even suspension in middle school, and much less likely to drop out of high school. Much more likely to drop out of high school and less likely to graduate. And we've seen data from the pandemic that shows this is truly having an effect. So NAEP scores have been decreasing, and part of that seems to be explained by kids just not being there to get what they need. Now, I want to just for a moment go into terms, because as state board members or interested advocates, you need to know these terms mean really different things. There's average daily attendance, which tends to tell you things like, how many kids typically show up like on the first 2 days of the Thanksgiving break? Maybe we should think about a longer Thanksgiving break because those 2 days aren't such an effective thing for families. Or half-day parent-teacher conferences. Man, logistics seem to be a problem. Families can't get to kids' school, and it allows, or the snowy days, kids aren't prepared, and we might want to invest. So it gives you an aggregate pattern that you can think about group solutions to address, but it can mask individual chronic absence because it's telling you how many kids typically show up, not how many and which kids are missing so much school they're academically at risk. Truancy only looks at unexcused absences. It tends to look at compliance with school rules. You should have been here because that's part of compulsory ed. And if you don't show up, or then I might threaten you with court. That's different from looking at chronic absence, which is looking at all absences, looking at when you're not here, you're missing out on these learning, engagement, other kinds of opportunities. It really thinks about the importance of taking a prevention, problem-solving, trauma-informed approach, because when kids and families have chronic absence, it can mean that they face challenge. And it's about family and student engagement. I just want to point out that excused versus unexcused is a really important thing for us to start paying attention to, because when kids have unexcused absences, it may start pushing them out. You have two kids who are sick, one kid's sick and without a doctor's note, one kid is sick and with a doctor's note. The kids without the doctor's note ends up having unexcused absences. And that might mean they aren't getting help to make up for what they missed. They might not even be able to get credit for what happened in the class that day. And so they're being slowly pushed out. That's even before you get to more challenging legal and punitive responses. But let's go back to this issue of chronic absence for a second. What we've seen, and we have national data now that confirms that, in the 21-22 school year, chronic absence nearly doubled from 16 to 30% of kids, or 8 million to 14.7 million of kids. And that early data from 22-23 shows that it's still pretty high, gotten a little better, and in some places a little more better, that it's uneven how the progress is happening across states, but it's still much higher than before the pandemic, and it's especially high in the early elementary grades, as well as in high school. And I'm now going to let Bob talk about the big ahas we gained from doing a school level analysis of the data that the feds collect from EdFacts for the 21-22 school year.
Thanks, Hedy. So that there's sort of two big points to keep in mind. That this data first is from 21-22, so just to situate us, that was sort of supposedly the first full year back from the pandemic, when schools were by and large were open, but many still faced temporary closings because of outbreaks, or students themselves were in quarantine, or classrooms were in quarantine. So there was still some interruptions from the pandemic. But schools were trying to sort of have normal operations. And what we've seen is in that year, we reached extraordinary heights of chronic absenteeism, which means although schools were open, all the kids most certainly were not back. And so the first thing, if we go back to the slide, is that with this big rise, when chronic absenteeism doubles, it doubles in part because it's spread almost everywhere, right? And so we can see is that this new version of chronic absenteeism post-pandemic, we find it in cities, we find it in suburbs, we find it in rural areas, we find it in towns, we find it everywhere. And that's at some level is the pandemic effect, because everybody had those pandemic impacts. Next slide. We also see that it, all types of kids are chronically absent in a similar vein. Right, large numbers of white students, of Black students, of Latino students, and also we know that in things like, Native groups, some other groups, it's a very high percentage of them, right? Which we can see here, right? As well, it affects everybody. Some groups were even more impacted. Groups that had some struggles before the pandemic or some challenges in getting to school every day. It was just further magnified. And in part we know, and this will be the other part of the story, is that the intensity, although chronic absenteeism spread everywhere, the intensity with which it spread closely tracked the areas hardest hit by the pandemic, which were often lower income communities, communities of color, and other places like that in the nation. And so then we see even higher levels. I'm just going to pause at this slide for a minute because the numbers are easy to read, but they're really important to understand the magnitude. So in this year, 21-22, the majority of students, and really 2/3 of students, it's more than the majority, 2 out of 3 students attended a school in which 20% or more of the students in that school were chronically absent. And why that's important is prior research has shown when you get to that 20% threshold, the whole school is impacted by chronic absenteeism, not just the kids that are absent. And primarily that is because it means teachers are seeing a different constellation of kids in their classroom every day, which almost by necessity has to slow down the pace of instruction, because teachers are left either to say, let me remind you what we did yesterday, and then lose the kids that were there, maybe even a behavior disruption that you have to take care of because of that. Or if you weren't here, ask a friend because we have to move ahead. Lose those kids, perhaps have a behavior disruption and be slowed down. And just this magnitude, right? Pre-pandemic, this was true for 1 of 4 schools, which was far too many. But post-pandemic, it was 2 out of 3 schools, which means that many schools that didn't have that magnitude of a challenge before, where the whole school was impacted, suddenly found themselves in that situation where the whole school was impacted. And there's large numbers of kids that are to try to get back to school. Just the sheer volume could be overwhelming, right, at that initial thing if you don't have prior experience with it. All right, next slide. And Hedy foreshadowed this. Again, this wave cut across all schools, but a subset of schools that really experienced this, like, we didn't have so much experience now, and now many of us are facing these challenges, was at the elementary level. If we look prior to pandemic, there were about 3,000 high schools that had 30% of their kids are more absent, like the most extreme level, almost a third of your kids are chronically absent. That went from 3,000 to 19,000 elementary schools. So that's 16,000 elementary schools that pre-pandemic didn't have the experience of this intensity and find themselves with it post-pandemic, right? Next slide. So on one hand, the stories of this widespread pandemic effects broadly impacting many schools, many that were not impacted before. But if you think of it as sort of a tide coming in, right? You know, the tide is reaching more land, but the places that are already underwater get deeper when that happens, right? And so when we look at the impacts of poverty, and again, we know there's associated with poverty with the intensity of the impact of the pandemic is there, plus just the realities of living in poverty, which existed before and continue. We see again another fairly thing that you really got to take a moment to process. So if we look at schools where 75% or more of the kids are eligible for free and reduced price lunch, we see in 2022 that 70% of them had extreme chronic absenteeism, 30% or more of their kids chronically absent. If we add in those that were at 20% or more, we're basically at 90% of those schools face school level impacts from chronic absenteeism, right? So the whole school is being impacted. 9 out of 10 of high poverty schools. If we look at our, just go back. If we look at, places that only have, 0 to 24% poverty, we see, only 35% of those schools. Still a lot, but 35 is a lot different in magnitude than 90. And we really see that in the next slide. When we looked at the district impact of this. So before we're looking at students and schools, now in our second blog, we talked about districts. And we asked ourselves, which districts are there that have many schools facing high levels of chronic absenteeism? Because when that's true, you need a district solution, right? You can't ask 15, 20 schools individually to try to respond to 30% or more of their kids chronically absent. You really need a district approach. And what this showed, again, is if a district is a high poverty district, again, that 75% free and reduced price lunch threshold, we see that in 41% of those districts, 76, 3/4 to all of their schools had extreme chronic absenteeism. We add those districts where it was half or more of their schools had extreme chronic absenteeism, and we're at 58% of high poverty districts have half or more of their schools with the highest levels of chronic absenteeism. Again, think about the pressure that puts on that system, the resources that calls for, how that slows down instruction, how that challenges just the energy, right, of the people doing the work. And then we look at our districts that have more favorable, economic conditions, where less than 25% of their students are eligible for reduced lunch. And we see that fully 65% of those districts had no schools with extreme chronic absenteeism. So they're much more able to move ahead with recovery and accelerated learning and focused instruction because their kids are there, right? And they don't have to. Whereas over here, they have the 2-level challenge, right? And in many places, and often with less resources to handle it. All right.
So
let me make one editorial comment if I can, Hedy, before we go into the solutions piece. And this audience is used to me saying this, we can look at the national data, but each and every one of you, your state has this data in some way, shape, or form, and you shouldn't hesitate. If you're not familiar with it, if maybe you've never seen it, it's never been presented at a board meeting or in other, public ways. Some states include them in their accountability dashboards or what have you. Don't hesitate to ask. And sometimes even people can portray them geographically, so that you can see where are these schools, who are the places that are struggling the most, and so forth and so on. One of the questions, Hedy, that we got in advance was how does it look at different grade levels? Do you want to comment on that a little bit?
Sure. Typically, so we don't have national data by grade level, by the way. This is actually something that I think we could cure. It's not like the data states don't have it, but the federal government doesn't actually ask for it to be submitted by grade level. And many states, by the way, because of that, don't actually publish it by grade level. Ohio, where you came from, Paulo does, but many don't. And actually, that's something that people could also be advocating for, because typically you see this curve, high in elementary, and then depending on what happens in the transition, you see different things in middle school, and then by 9th grade, you're starting to see a spike up. Sometimes you see this weird downturn in 12th grade, but it's more because the kids with the most chronic absence have dropped out. So you've got to be careful about how you interpret the data. The one other thing I would just add, Paulo, just so that people are aware, this is actually a part of a 3-part blog. So as Bob said, so we did the first one talking about the 2/3 of kids in schools with 20% or more. This last one was on demographics. The third blog is actually going to happen in January, and we're going to have state level 21-22 data. But many states already have their 22-23 data. What I think is unusual about how we've done this is most people just look at percentage chronic absence. They don't do these bands. So, if you look at, this is saying how many kids are how many schools have extreme, high, modest. So the levels in schools is a different way of thinking about it. And that is not something that I think you can easily take data and figure these things out. But that's where I think this new data is a little different of a picture, helping people to understand. And part of the reason why you want to know that is when you have high levels of chronic absence in a school, you have lots of kids who are chronically absent. It really reflects systemic issues that are eroding these basic positive conditions for learning. They may not feel physically, emotionally healthy and safe, or a belonging. So, disengagement has been a huge issue. The lack of academic challenge engagement, which when you think about what Bob talked about, what happens in the classroom when you have, 20% or more, and the teacher's trying to figure out, do I move ahead? Do I, then you start getting academic disengagement, right? So that the challenges get connected to this. And then this issue of, are we investing in the adult and student well-being? We do have challenges of staff well-being and staff mental health and staff supports, because staff have to be there in relationships. And actually, staff have to show up every day for kids to feel they're connected to staff. So when you have high levels, it really reflects an erosion, and that might require interventions that directly address this. The key to reducing chronic absence is really understanding, why are kids not showing up in the first place? Is it barriers in the community? Is it aversion? And this could have to do with what's happening in school, or even the fact that if kids missed out on different periods of time in the pandemic, but then didn't get the supports or the tutoring to make up for that, they're feeling incredible anxiety about coming back to class because learning is scaffolded and they don't feel like they'll be successful. Or disengagement. And again, both the relationships to adults and peers, or bullying that might be happening. And then misconceptions. And one of the challenges we see right now is both people think that excused illness-related absences can't be addressed, when in fact many can be prevented. We can get kids to wash their hands on a very simple level, to reduce the spread of disease, or get them access to dental care and health care and immunizations. But also, when kids are sick right now, we've gone back to earlier norms of, if you have a sniffle, if you have a mild stomach ache, that isn't a reason for you to stay home. If you do stay home, it doesn't mean you have to quarantine for 5 days or 10 days. And yet there's a lot of myths about staying home related to illness that exist from the pandemic. And so what we have to do is unpack these, particularly in those communities with high levels, it means we got to invest in these positive conditions for learning, make sure we have multi-tiered systems of support that start with prevention, because if conditions aren't positive and I go say, hey, Paolo, you should be in school, but you don't feel welcome, engaged, or connected, that's going to fall on deaf ears. And Bob, do you want to say a little bit about these particular strategies that we've pulled out
Sure.
as especially important?
Yeah. And I'll do it. And I just want to foreshadow that by just saying that we don't need to take the slides back, but when it's important to know that when we saw those big buckets for the reasons kids are chronically absent, to recognize that the pandemic is operating through all of those levels, but it can vary by place which ones are the more predominant. So it is important for people to do local surveying and local discussions with their students and families to understand where their bigger drivers are. Because in some places, high school kids took work during the pandemic and they want to keep working, and the minimum wage is higher. In other places, the minimum wage isn't so much higher, and it's not quite the same impact. There was a lot of tragedy in the pandemic. Hundreds of thousands of students lost parents, and millions lost grandparents. That varies, though, where that was more intense than other places. So it is important to understand some of these local dynamics, to understand which of those drivers are the most impactful in your area. But the point we want to make here is that at both the district and state level, given the level of magnitude we have and the sheer number of schools that are addressing these challenges, there's really a need for sort of a comprehensive solution, right? And not just thinking this one driver will do it. We find the one thing and we do it, and that will change the needle. We're gonna have to do multiple strategies together and tailoring them to like what's needed in a community. And 4 that we highlight that we know have demonstrated impacts on reducing chronic absenteeism, we really call out here. So 1 is family engagement, proactively engaging families, both to help problem solve with what's preventing kids from coming to school on a regular basis, but also just to reconnect them to schooling as a daily ritual, right? It's just the thing that it's the normal thing to get up and go to school every day. We lost a little bit of that in the pandemic, right? Student connectedness, and this is the thing I talked a lot about in my essay in the NASBE journal. We know when kids are connected to school, many good things happen, and we know that to connect kids to school, they have to believe there's an adult that knows and cares about them as a person, that they have a supportive peer group, that they're engaged in meaningful activities, and they feel welcome in school for who they are. And those are things that are actually fairly measurable. And schools can get baselines on which percentage of our kids have each of these dimensions. And from that baseline, you can then build progress, right? If you know what your baseline is, you know where you have work to do. Health is another important strand at 2 levels. 1 is, giving new and updated guidance about when kids need to be kept home and when it's okay to send them to school. And during the pandemic, necessarily, we had very strict views on that because we had to. But in some cases, that's still carrying over, and even the slightest sniffle is still seen as like a reason to keep kids at home. So it's like getting updated guidance on that, but then also recognizing that there were, in many cases, schools where kids got treatment for health conditions at some level, like in school-based clinics or various things, and even like eyeglass checkups, like were done in 1st grade or kindergarten. Well, if you were not in school in kindergarten and 1st grade, maybe you didn't get your eyeglass checkup, your vision checkup, right? And now you're in 3rd grade and you can't see the board because no one's checked your vision. So we have to make sure about going back and doing some of those building blocks of sort of general health provision. And then we finally argue that community schools is a good way to pull all of this together and bring in outside supports, because schools can't, at the magnitude of when you have 200-300 kids chronically absent, it's very hard for the school staff alone to be able to have the people power to address all those issues. And community schools is one venue to bring in the community in an organized way. And then the final thing we say is that you need a sort of an air traffic control system to progress monitor kids on their attendance and its impacts on other academic outcomes on a continuing basis, and figure out, do we have a health issue? Do we have a transportation issue? What are our issues that we need to solve at sort of a group level? And things like good, multi-tiered student support systems, or what Grad Partnership argues as for student success systems, which are sort of the next generation of that work, are very important to have sort of teams of teachers progress monitoring kids on these key things like attendance, and then figuring out a tiered set of responses.
So I just wanted to mention, and this is actually covered in that NASBE article a little bit, we are seeing some successes. This is data on Connecticut, and you can see started to reach up, almost doubled to 24%, almost during the pandemic. And then I'm looking at the very first cluster, and is now went down to 20% at the end of last year. It's about 17.8, which is actually lower than it was the first month of September last year. Connecticut publishes its data on a regular basis, and they're also seeing reductions in all of their highest need groups. What I know is that what Connecticut is doing is taking a systemic approach. So this is an example of what states can do. They're making data available actually monthly on a public basis, so people can see where chronic absence is a challenge. They've invested and created multiple ways of engaging, a family engagement approach statewide. They also have something called the Learner Engagement and Attendance Program, which is a multiple home visit approach, which doesn't start by scolding people about attendance, but using attendance to figure out where you need to deepen partnerships and engagement and visit families over time to connect them to local resources. That resulted in actually a 15%, on average, 15% attendance improvement for the kids who got it. Strategic partnerships, because sometimes, for example, even taking the LEAP home visits, some of them are done by community partners. They knew that staff were tired, so they used their data to figure out which schools, which districts had greater needs, and then quickly started offering up those resources to those school districts so they could expand and bring in community partners, as well as hire extra staff to be able to do that work. The health partnership with in order to really have meaningful health guidance and make sure that people believe it, you need your health providers on board. And Connecticut also had those deep partnerships with their Department of Public Health, using their data to figure out who needed things more, and then making this all about shared capacity and that accountability, and then building capacity. They do monthly professional development sessions where people can hear about promising bright spots and learn about the newest data and work together. And this is one of the benefits of the pandemic. You don't always have to have in-person conferences. You can do a lot through webinars to really expand professional development. Ultimately, what I think states might need to consider, and you might want to all see what's in place in your states or not, is they're going to, because so the challenge is, as Bob talked about when he talked about the numbers of schools that now are seeing high and extreme levels, this is now widespread, but we also know it's deeply concentrated. So it means that everyone actually needs a bit of support on this issue. So is that state guidance on effective practices, a state messaging campaign, so not everyone has to reinvent the wheel around messaging? Is that good uniform data so you can really understand how to collect and use your data? That can be state supports. Then with districts with higher levels of chronic absence, you might want to do a targeted investment. Make sure they get the community schools, make sure they get extra expanded learning, and create a community of practice where those districts can learn from each other, or schools in those districts can be part of a community of practice. And then for the lowest performing schools, you're likely to need intensive technical assistance and coaching, partly because what you really need is a coordinated, not fragmented approach where people are working across departments, and that might take more intensive supports. So just again, this is part of a 3-part series. So here's links, and you can also have access to these on our website, to the first 2 that already came out, and then stay tuned for the 3rd one. And I'm going to stop sharing. There
you go. Fantastic. So this is a time where I would encourage people to put their questions in the Q&A. I'm going to start with a couple from the stack that was submitted ahead of time. Hedy, why don't you tell us a little bit about, can you give us a couple of stories about schools that have taken on certain approaches that have proven to be fruitful, both in terms of identifying some of the causes that may be contributing to their absence, whether those are health related, transportation related, other things, or even very uniquely, tailored to each individual student, and what kinds of things have proven to have had an impact?
So what I'm seeing is, again, that really tiered approach and starting with positive engagement. Let me give an example of this is actually in Monterey County in California. They actually work with their schools, so they all learned about what was. So what I would say is two things: learning new behaviors and putting them in place can take time, and you got to help people do that time. And part of what you're really needing to do is change mindsets. So one thing that happens is that people, when they see a kid who's absent, they don't start with blame. They start with, oh, something's not happening and I need to build relationship, deepen relationship, and I need to support families. And I'm going to make sure every kid in my school has a relationship, and that when there are some times where kids aren't showing up, someone says something, and when kids are showing up, someone actually recognizes it and actually supports them in that. And so the other thing I think is people are using data. And they're using it so it's not by chance that you notice who's missing too much, but you're noticing early, so that then for those kids, you're even ensuring greater outreach. And you're not doing it with, one of the things you have to actually almost shift is practice from sending blaming kind of punitive notifications to say, hey, you missed school, how can I help you? And then there's having community partners who can help address when those barriers of food or lack of transportation, and how you can do that. Now, in Monterey County, one of the things that sometimes happens is people think that it's going to be one social worker who's going to address the issue, and that doesn't fix it. You actually have to have everyone on school equipped, and think about how do you build relationship building into every, the structure of schooling, both with kids and with families. And in Monterey County, they were able to this is the County Office of Ed, it's kind of an intermediary. They took a number of their school districts, and one of their school districts, Salinas Elementary School District, took all of its schools and they showed them gave them basic concepts about chronic absence, and then they left it to all of the schools to try implementing them. And then they looked at their data every single month, and then they saw which schools had the best outcomes. Turned out the best elementary school was the one that had really taken a whole school approach to relationship building. And then they used that school to share the information from the other schools so that they could adopt the same approach. And as a district, they started seeing real reductions because they could use their data, but build upon this notion and this concept of using data, outreach, and engagement and relationship building.
Yeah, no, I love that, because a lot of times that, again, people in the audience will know that I tell them, look for those places that are beating the odds and try to figure out what they're doing and use those as exemplars as you work to help acclimate others to the issue and some of the possible solution approaches, knowing full well that, there's not a one-size-fits-all strategy here. What may work in one community is different than others. What may work for one child may be different than it is for others.
I will also say that I think folks who have been able to really invest in their healthcare, using school nurses, expanding that infrastructure, but the thing is that we sometimes operate too fragmented. So the school nurse operates over here, the attendance committee operates over here, as opposed to having the school nurse be part of the attendance committee, and the school nurse maybe being the first person to call families, because that's actually the least threatening person to call family and find out what's going on.
We have a question come through that has to do with data collection and some inconsistencies in how absence is defined school by school. Schools may have different definitions of how much time, if a student is out, does that count as an absence? Does that count as something else? One district, I'll read what it says. One district might count a full day if a child doesn't leave school until right after lunch, and other variations. Are there ways to be more standardized in terms of those kinds of definitions and data collection?
Absolutely. And this is where states come into play, very much so. So I'll just go back. So states can define both what's the definition of chronic absence, and do you include all absences, but equally, and maybe even more important sometimes, what constitutes a day of attendance or a day of absence. The most common definition, and it's part of what the Fed's guidance actually says, is consider a kid there as long as they're there at least 50% or more of the day. And by the same token, if they're not there less than 50%, then they're considered not there. Now, Connecticut, for example, they defined in 2008 half a day of attendance, being in school as what's a day of attendance. They actually, I think, are more likely to notice kids missing school because they have a, if you will, more robust. And they actually kept that day of attendance during the pandemic and also used it to define virtual learning. So when other places were seeing decreases in chronic absence when school went virtually, they were still seeing increases, and it allowed them to notice early on that they had a chronic absence challenge. And it also allowed them to notice early on that their virtual learning options were not working so well because kids who were mostly virtual were not showing up, and they had to really shift kids back to in-person. There are a lot of states who don't define attendance. They leave it up to every locality. And I think that's a huge mistake.
I think the other observation I would make is what we really don't want is for people to see this strictly as a compliance exercise, right? What we want people to do is actually care, right? Care about why Johnny or Susie isn't in school. And if that means maybe they're just consistently missing first period, but first period is their English class, right? I mean, the caring adult should still care and know enough to say, like, I wonder what the challenge is for this particular child, this particular family, and what can we as a school do to help solve that particular issue? Is that engage with the parents? Is that, and sometimes it becomes a scheduling issue for that child or some other, approach that can be very modest, but still have a tremendous impact.
Yeah. And one thing we have to keep in mind, again, given the magnitude of the challenge, is that we both need to have those like very customized, individualized solutions and recognize we need a very strong sort of like prevention or like just whole school. And that's really where I think this idea of school connectedness comes in, that like
right.
Schools can invest in connecting all kids to school, whether they're chronically absent or they're just missing a few days. It helps everybody. And by doing that, you reduce the number of kids you need customized solutions for. Because when you get up to n equals 200 of customized solutions, it sort of, the system breaks down, right? And so you really have to have that strong prevention and customization.
Say a little bit more, Bob, about, how does one create a culture in a school where kids actually want to be there? Because I think part of it is that if a student like says, I really love going to school, then they're gonna create that vibe within their family and increase the likelihood that they actually manage to get there somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, think of two different kids, and these are both real kids I've seen at different times. Kid number one, nobody knows me, nobody cares. So if I'm at school, nobody notices me, no one really talks to me, no one ever, encourages me or whatever. And, it's raining out today and I don't have a raincoat. So the most logical thing for anyone to do in that situation is to stay home. That's just right. Versus another kid that like, God, there's these people that really care about me. I got this group of friends that's going to miss me. We're doing this really cool project in science. And I just feel welcome in that school. Like, I'm going to get wet at the bus stop to make sure I'm there. Like, that's the difference in like motivation between those, sort of two poles.
And Paul,
yeah, go ahead.
I would just add that, I do worry as we see the waning of COVID relief dollars. What we have to think about is how do we leverage existing initiatives to take this work to scale? So when Bob talks about school connectedness, I immediately think about expanded learning programs. What perfectly positioned programs to, engage in that student connectedness, and they should even be taking the, is there adult, kids know there's adult, they can survey kids, they can find out. They could even have kids who are, if they want them to be in a meaningful activity, I keep thinking, Bob, we could have kids be in meaningful activities, identifying what are the barriers to attendance and what are the things that make kids want to show up to school, and how do you make a school feel relevant? That can be their meaningful activity in school. And I think we should be thinking about how do we incorporate that into expanded learning? How do we make that part of the curriculum? How is it not, some add-on that's going to be dependent on whether or not we have additional COVID relief dollars, but rather an integrated part of a program that we already are offering in our school?
Yeah, I mean, and to me, the takeaway from that is, engage your students, talk to your students. There are plenty of climate survey tools. Panorama has one, Gallup does one, and many schools have developed their own to, again, get inside, what are children, I shouldn't say children, students are upfront and honest to tell you about like what's working for them, what's not working for them, what are the kinds of things that turn them off, what are the kinds of things that they value and they love, and those things can be very they can contribute to the work a school does in creating those conditions where students want to be there and they're excited about learning, and that's such a big part of this. Right, it could be the classes they're taking, could be the clubs. I've known schools that have made a point where every student has to be part of a club, right? And it sounds like craziness, but at the end of the day, when you actually see it in action, it's just elegant and beautiful. And those kids, that motivates them to say, hey, you know, the photography club is meeting, you know, after school today or during the lunch period or whatever, and that's what holds them. All right, I think we've gone a little bit over. I see one question just came in. Oh, this is a great question. In Arkansas, we have more districts moving to a 4-day school week. Is there any research on absenteeism when it comes to the 4-day school week? Does it go down? Does it get worse? Do you have any sense of that?
So I think this fits in the bucket. We've talked about that when you have a state has a major initiative, be it a 4-day week or the science of reading or whatever thing they're rolling out, they really need to factor in the role of chronic absenteeism and the outcomes they're likely to get. My sense is that it's possible there's a small fraction of kids that are chronically absent that only coming 4 out of 5 days might impact, but probably not a lot. So you're already down 1 day, and then you're going to still have chronic absenteeism taking you down another day. So you have more kids on, you know, kids, I would tell you, there's a bunch of high school kids that often joke about being on the 4-day-a-week plan. Now you're going to have kids on the 3-day-a-week plan. I'm not sure if that's going to lead to better outcomes. I don't know. You know, they got to be aware of it.
This was more about half day versus full day. I think it was kindergarten. There was research that found that, and I would have actually thought that full day would have helped to improve attendance, but I think that depends on, I think in many places it does. It kind of depends on how much families are choosing half day and they have the logistics to manage it versus full day. But what they did find, which is relevant to this 4-day thing, was that chronic absence in half day had a greater impact because kids then had less time to make up for the lost instructional time that they had in the half day programs. So I think I think they ought to do research, by the way. If they're going to move to 4 days, sounds like Arkansas is moving that, they should actually look at and find a way so that when we take on these reforms, we're carefully considering whether they have some unintended impacts or they achieve what we hope they will achieve. Yep.
Great. Thank you so very much for being part of this webinar. My commitment always to our participants is to say, if you want to follow up on any questions or if you need additional information, never hesitate to reach out to NASBE, to myself or the NASBE staff. We can connect you with Bob and Hedy or share with you other resources that we may have. And for those of you who have an interest in maybe working on this issue, we're always interested in connecting people to those tools and resources that can allow them to actually take action. And like I said, it's, you know, looking at your own state's data or maybe your district's data or maybe even your school's data, understanding, you know, what's working, finding exemplars that are doing good things that may make a difference, being part of an effort in your state or your district or your school to say, hey, this is something we can do something about. And maybe even digging into some of these broader issues of how do you create a really engaging and a school climate that really, you know, children see as relevant and as exciting as a place where they want to be. So with that, thank you very much for being with us. Enjoy the rest of your day. And of course, happy holidays to all of you.